So I believe this is where we left off the other day, right? We were talking about the creatine phosphate pathway and immediate or phosphagen sources of energy. Okay. So this just shows very, very simply what that reaction looks like. Okay. You've got a molecule of, and this was brought, Christina brought this to my attention with some questions earlier today. So depending upon from which book I have pulled the figure or the text, it's sometimes referred to as creatine phosphate, SCP. Other times it's referred to as phosphocreatine or PCR. They are the same thing. Those things are interchangeable. So my apologies for kind of how that goes. I may switch back and forth from one to the other depending upon kind of how tired I am. But we've got creatine phosphate in your muscle. There's an enzyme called creatine kinase. Remember, kinase enzymes add a phosphate group, or in this instance, they take a phosphate group off. They're taking the phosphate group off of creatine kinase and putting it on the ADP in that particular way. So PCR interacts with creatine kinase. Okay, we can get split. That all these two things are in the presence of ADP, and voila, the reaction goes to what we would call the right here. Let me tell my wife that I'm teaching, but I can't talk right now. So very simple reaction. That's why it's very fast. Okay. The thing that controls the rate of this reaction is primarily ADP. Okay. Primary rate control is ADP. As long as we've got some creatine phosphate, we've got the enzyme, right? Then as ADP goes up, it drives this thing to the right. As ADP goes down, ATP goes up, we're going to start driving ourselves back to the left. Okay. We talked about this the other day, but when you stop exercising, then we're going to resynthesize creatine phosphate from ATP and run this reaction essentially in reverse from ATP, and that ATP is going to solely be generated from aerobic metabolism. How we know that, I don't know. Okay, it's almost impossible. Like I don't really know how we can measure that in those particular ways, right, inside the cell. But that's the general way this goes, right? One of the things that we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you guys, is measuring in an intact animal or human, measuring anaerobic metabolism. So measuring depletion of creatine phosphate, measuring glycolysis in the purest sense of the word, where we're going to make lactic acid and then dissociate, measuring ATP stores in the muscle is incredibly difficult. Okay, it's incredibly difficult. And in many instances, very, very impractical. And so one of the things that we can try to do to get at some of this stuff is we can look at resynthesis or reconstitution of these things and then try to infer from that some additional information. Okay, so that resynthesis is going to take place at a thing right on the mitochondria, near the mitochondria, called the creatine phosphate shuttle. Okay, called the creatine. You've got a creatine kinase enzyme that will be located in the membrane of the mitochondria. And so you've got a muscle cell, you've got a mitochondria in the muscle cell. Okay, in here, right, we're going to have some PCR, and you're going to have some creatine, some free creatine that are floating around. I know I've not drawn them anywhere close to scale, but then we're going to have some creatine kinase enzymes that are out here in the cytoplasm, which are going to drive some of this reaction. But then you're also going to have a creatine kinase enzyme on the mitochondria. And so the mitochondria is making a bunch of ATP aerobically. A free molecule of creatine is going to come and it's going to interact with this creatine kinase enzyme, and that's going to make back our PCR. Okay, that's the idea of the creatine phosphate shuttle. Okay. And so I've always been baffled by, well, why can't this happen like in the middle of exercise? Like I'm going at a relatively submaximal level, right? This is floating around. All of these things are going to take place just by random interactions. And it may be that it does. I've never gotten a good answer on this. Okay. So if anybody knows anything or can find anything, please let me know. It may be that it does happen, but then the PCR gets immediately broken back down again. And so that because we can't measure it very easily without putting it in a magnet, then it doesn't really kind of matter sometimes, right? And then your energy use is all the same because you used ATP here to restore it, and then it got broken down again. So it's kind of a zero sum there. Okay. But primarily the shuttle is going to take place after you stop exercising, after we've gotten things back in. Okay. So what we see here, these are some data that were published in 2009. I just like the graphs on this particular one. And what you can see is this is the way that we measure creatine phosphate levels is we do this using magnetic resonance spectroscopy. Okay, so we put you in an MRI unit, which is only going to cost us a couple $1,000s an hour to do. The magnet itself costs about $5 million, give or take. You got to build a building to put the magnet in. But I'm telling you guys, if you got free money, just like hanging out somewhere, let's build a magnet and have an imaging center, because those things will be booked from sun up to sundown at like $2 to $3 grand of insurance reimbursement all the time, all the time. You pay some, poor tech like 50 grand a year to sit on their butt and punch buttons on the machine. So a lot of investment. They're really, really valuable. So what you see here is the relative percentage of creatine phosphate in comparison to resting levels. So this is going to be resting levels here, okay? And there's a bout of exercise, and what you're noticing, so this is usually done with people doing isometric contractions with their plantar flexion. So this is probably, I should have looked today, this is probably in either the soleus or one of the heads of the gastron, okay? But people are in there and they're doing some kind of isometric plantar flexion contraction. You don't really want the muscle to move too much in the magnet. That's kind of a problem. And then, but you're going to do this. This is a lighter intensity activity. This is a more intense activity. And so what you will note is that over time, right, this is a couple of minutes. We're making these measurements every 10 seconds or so. Bing, 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 bing. Right, creatine phosphate levels are going to fall. You can measure the creatine phosphate, right, using the spectroscopy. Then they stop exercising, and then we let them recover. So it goes down, and then we stop, and you can see recovery back up with these sort of exponential decay and resynthesis. Okay, here's the same thing. You will note that the exercise is more intense over a shorter period of time, so it's going to fall farther. Okay. And it's going to fall faster, which would indicate this is a much higher intensity activity. And so usually what they do with this is this may be constant. This is just push and hold, and this is push, relax, push, relax, push, relax. You can go back and look, and then you'll note the same sort of recovery thing. All right. What I have not shown you is if this rate of recovery here and here is dependent upon aerobic metabolism. The really, really cool thing we can do with all of this is I can figure out how aerobically trained you are by seeing how fast you reconstitute creatine phosphate at the end of exercise. We can fit these curves, right, and measure slope constant or time constant or half-life or whatever your favorite way of quantifying those things are, and it will tell us something. People that are better trained aerobically in that muscle for the same level of depletion will resynthesize or reconstitute faster. Okay? They'll reconstitute faster. I'll show you guys, we can do something that looks a little bit like this in our labs downstairs. But we don't use the magnet, we use near infrared spectroscopy, we look at the binding of hemoglobin, the oxygen to hemoglobin, the oxyhemoglobin, and deoxyhemoglobin. It's the same kind of thing that this recovery is going to kind of increase. Okay, so you guys can imagine if I need to put a person in a magnet to do this, I got to do isometric contractions, then it's hard for us if we can't go out and like run, right? We can't go and we can't test Sarah while she's playing in a volleyball match. Okay, we can't do these kinds of things. You can't go test Brady while he goes to play pickup basketball, because we all know that Brady loves to play pickup basketball, don't we, Brady? It's hoop game. So that's kind of the way we can look at all of this. All right. Okay. Questions about any of that? We're going to step away from creatine phosphate. I should have found some data on. I should have gotten a Wingate test and stuck that in there for you guys to see what happens with power output and how it corresponds to creatine levels. But it's sort of all the same thing. Okay. Y'all don't perk up. We will do some things and deplete some creatine quickly. So see how that goes. All right. So the next one of our phosphagen systems is a reaction called the Myokinase reaction. Right? Myokinase reaction. And again, it is named for the enzyme that drives the reaction, myokinase. But what happens with the myokinase reaction is if we get enough ADP floating around inside of our cell, those ADP molecules may interact, two of them may interact with the myokinase enzyme, and we will take a phosphate off of one of them and put it on the other. So we make ATP and then AMP. So we get an adenosine monophosphate out of all of this. Okay. This is not a great thing for us to do. It's not a particularly efficient thing for us to do, because in some ways the ADP levels that we will note that we're going to have in here are going to be the thing that helps us control and drive our other reactions. And so it's not great to split all the way down to AMP. But some of this is going to happen. But again, there's only a certain amount of ATP, therefore there can only be a certain amount of ADP in the muscle. And so you can only do this to some limited capacity to be able to get extra. But it's a non-negligible amount. Like there is some amount that we get from all of this. So the AMP can play some roles with the rate control of some of the glycolytic enzymes in glycolysis. I'm remembering off the top of my head, I think it plays a role in controlling PFK, which is the rate stuff in glycolysis. I'm sure that it does some other things. I'm sure that it does. But ADP is the primary thing that controls or drives increases in pretty much all of the other metabolic pathways. But the really, really big thing is just we need this, but also there's only a limited amount. And so even if we could go all the way and turn all of our ADP at some point down into all of this, then we still haven't gotten ourselves more than a couple seconds more worth of contractions. Okay. Proceed.
So with AMP being a byproduct, it's reversible so that PI can, yeah, okay.
It's also reversible, but right, it's going to take twice as much energy to get that back to ATP, because you got to turn AMP back to ADP, then turn that back to ATP. But it is reversible, absolutely. Okay. So here's a table that I liked, and I was hopeful that what it would try to show you guys is just some general ideas, okay, of kcal total per sort of muscle mass, all right, that we have that's available from these phosphagen energy systems, okay, and so these are data that have been based on some very old studies, but I still liked it. I don't know that it's really of use to anybody to do this again, but you've got some data from a very famous exercise physiologist who will come up again, Edwards, that were published in '82. This is concentrations of these things in millimoles per kilogram of an actual muscle. And then we've got total muscle mass. We're assuming 30 kilograms of muscle from a 70-kilogram dude. And then we're assuming in some of our other calculations how much useful energy we have, that there's 10 kcals per mole of ATP. All of those are based upon different studies. What you will just note is this is how much energy is available in your muscles, okay, via free ATP, via creatine phosphate, okay, and then the Myokinase ATP equivalent. So if you're going to run and make some ATP out of 2 ATP molecules, the total sort of phosphagen system that we have. So what I like to say is that if you look at this, you've got somewhere between 4 and 5 times the capacity, right, to make ATP out of creatine phosphate than you do from free ATP, right? And if I turn all of this into ADP, then this gets cut in half. That gets me my Myokinase equivalent there. And I'm sure what you're going to ask me is next, or you should, is, well, Dr. Black, this is fine. What does this number 11 mean? And what does this look like in comparison to what's available through glycolysis or the aerobic metabolic pathways or something? And the numbers are sort of unitless in some ways. They don't really mean anything. And I don't have a good number to tell you. In the aerobic pathways, the number is basically somewhere near infinity if you can meet certain criteria. And then with glycolysis, it's going to be, significantly more than this. Okay, I would not want to give you a number. I could say it's 10 times or 20 times or something, but a little bit of that's going to differ based upon individual. Okay, but that's just kind of what I want you all to appreciate. Most of your phosphagen stuff is held in creatine phosphate. Okay? So we need the phosphagen system to help us do stuff quickly and at very, very high intensity. So when this stuff gets depleted, we got to slow down. We got to slow down. Okay. Again, this is going to show kind of a similar-ish thing, but it's going to show the relative change to rest at different exercise intensities. Okay. So what you can see here is change relative to rest in ATP levels, in creatine phosphate levels, okay, in ADP levels, in AMP levels, and in inorganic phosphate, right? Note that ATP levels don't change very much. Why does that make sense? Exactly. That's right. They're making the ATP. Weirdly enough, right up until the point of fatigue, ADP levels do not change very much in your muscles. When they fall, then you're screwed and you got to stop. Okay? So we would not expect them to change very much, which is good. Okay? So we haven't talked about VO2 max very much, but 35% of VO2 max, this is walking. 65, this is jogging, maybe a brisk jog for some of us. Okay? Or some of y'all, not so much me. 65 would not be a brisk jog, it would be a slow jog for me. And then here's 90%. So this is not an all-out sprint, but we're running very hard. Okay? And so just look, as work output has to go up, as force output has to go up, what you will note, basically the only thing that changes when you're walking is inorganic phosphate levels go up. That's fine. They go up like 100%, and you may think, oh, well, that's a bunch. Except that when you see you're doing this, they're up almost 800%. So it doesn't really matter. This is not enough to matter. There is some threshold level of increase in inorganic phosphate, which sort of signals that ATP is about to fall and is predictive of when you have to stop exercising. So we'll talk about that at the very, very end. It's a relative change in that way. So, but you can just note that right at that high intensities, you're walking, you're not using very much creatine phosphate. All that this denotes, the fact that these things don't change, all of this denotes is just that we are very easily able to meet the ATP demands of that particular exercise through all of our metabolic pathways. Okay? Through all of our metabolic pathways. We're not taxing the phosphagen system particularly hard when we're walking. We're hitting it a little bit at this, but a lot of that happened at the very, very beginning and that's going away. But when you're here and we're well beyond what our aerobic metabolism can supply, which we'll talk about, then we're really going to begin to tax the phosphagen system a whole bunch. But note this increase in ADP here and here, here and here. That's good. That helps drive our other reactions. Okay, we need that increase. We need ADP to go up to stimulate other reactions. Okay. Didn't realize it actually says over here why the ATP stays constant. Okay. Matt, are you cold? We need to get you a blanket or a hoodie. I think I have a hoodie in my office. We have an old nasty blanket in the lab that I'm happy to get you. I wouldn't use it, but you're welcome to in those ways. Okay. All right. Questions? We're going to leave talking about the phosphagen system for a little bit. We'll come back to it when we talk about how we control it and integrate it with the other pathways. Okay. Glycolysis is the one that I feel like is the most difficult to intellectually wrap your brain around. Okay. Maybe because of how I was taught about glycolysis. I have a mental block on this. I don't know how you guys have been taught, but glycolysis is a series of reactions with breakdown of glucose to lactic acid. It's coupled with the making of ATP from ADP. Okay. Top line, that's where we are. That's the deal. Okay. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. So all of the enzymes and substrates that we need for glycolysis are going to have to get into the cell, stay in the cytoplasm. That's going to become important when we try to figure out whether or not we're actually going to make lactic acid. Okay? Because to not make lactic acid, we have to take the pyruvate acid from the step before and get it into a mitochondria. So it's an additional step. So that becomes really, really important as the concentration of pyruvate or pyruvic acid is going to increase as the amount of mitochondria in our muscles increases or decreases, and the activity of an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase that drives pyruvic acid to lactic acid is going to change its sensitivity of things inside the cell. Okay. All right. Let's talk about what our substrate is. Let's talk about what our energy yield from all of this is. It uses glucose. Okay. It uses glucose. Where the glucose comes from is really important. Okay. Is really important. Glucose that comes out of the bloodstream. Okay. Glucose out of the bloodstream. So that glucose is either from food that you've eaten, okay, that you absorbed in your small intestine. It has come from glycogen stored in your liver. We'll talk about how we break that down next week, okay, or from the process of gluconeogenesis, also in the liver, right? So if it comes from the bloodstream, when we bring that into our cell, we're going to be able to make 2 ATP. We call that glucose free glucose. Bloodstream glucose is free glucose. That just means it's not bound to another glucose molecule. Okay? We get 2 ATP molecules. We'll show you why that's going to be the case. If by chance you get the glucose from the breakdown of glycogen in that muscle cell, we get 3 ATP from that. Okay. So what you should assume from this is that somewhere it costs us ATP to bring that glucose into the cell. It's not actually the bringing in that costs us, it's what we do to it to get it to stay and trap it in the cell. That's going to be the okay. So you can see from this, I'm either going to get double or triple the amount of ATP out of glycolysis that I would get from the creatine phosphate pathway or the Myokinase pathway. Okay. So in the grand scheme, compared to aerobic exercise or aerobic metabolism, this is not very much energy, but it's way more. Like it's double what you get from creatine phosphate. So that's a good thing. Okay, that's good. But if we're gonna talk about 2 or 3 versus I could get 36 or 38 or whatever the half numbers we want to talk about now, which I've never understood. You guys see that? You guys have this lately? Talk about you can make like 38 and a half, right? Because the ATP synthase, the enzyme, sometimes it makes 1, sometimes it makes 2. And so over many, many things, they kind of even out and you're like, oh, you're gonna, in general, you get a half. You don't actually make half an ATP. I don't like that, but that's okay. So I mean, you know, when you get 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 times what you do with this with aerobic, this seems like a negligible amount, but it's way more than phosphate. So that's good. Okay. It's a slower reaction than the creatine phosphate reaction. It's slower than Myokinase because it has, what do we say, Gabe? It has 11 steps or 12 steps or 13 steps. Okay. It all depends on what exactly we count as a step, and if you've got glucose from muscle glycogen, are you skipping the first step? Yes. So it just kind of there's more, right? The thing is 1 step versus a minute. Okay. The problem with this, okay, is if we make aerobic, what is going on with my brain today? If we make lactic acid at the end of all of this, which we often will, there's a chance, okay, that when the lactic acid dissociates into lactate and hydrogen ions, that those hydrogen ions, if their concentration gets high enough, become acidic inside the muscle cell, and that basically fucks everything up. Okay, it messes everything up. It will cause fatigue, okay, and pain. There are some people that still want to debate about all of those things. You go to our big national meeting, and about every 5 years, people get up and hand wave about data this and data that, and does lactic acid cause fatigue? And the guy that wrote my metabolism book, George Brooks, says no, it really doesn't, and it's a very nuanced kind of way of looking at things. But we'll get there. I'll show you guys where it's going to have some issues. Okay. In honor of my age, this picture is older than every one of you in here. Is my guess. This is from my undergraduate human physiology textbook, which I took in the fall of 1997. And the book was older, obviously, it was not brand new then. So my guess is that most of you guys were born after 1997. Is that right? Elijah's like, no. Okay. We close, Elijah, you don't have to tell us. Sorry, having a day. I apologize. 27. Okay. That would be the solution. At least took my caffeine this morning. I should have took one of my 18 pills. I should have done the rest. Okay. Wonders of fatherhood. Not only do our dogs got me up in the middle of the night, so I ended up sleeping on the couch with our dogs. We had reached some détente with them. But I have one that, like, he takes Prozac, he's super anxious and nervous, and then the other one wants to chase the cicadas all the time. And between the two of them, the nervous one wanted to sleep where he needs to be in a confined space to sleep where he gets squirrely. But that confined space needs to be where he could see my wife and I, or hear my wife and I. So we had made the baby gate, one of our old sort of baby gate things, into a little pen on the landing right at the top of our stairs outside of our bedroom. But then, because he's brilliant, he knows how to get out. And so he would just be like, I don't want to be in here anymore. And he'd just let himself out and be like, okay, people, I'm awake, let's go. So now I've been letting him sleep on the couch. And that seems to calm him. He hates thunderstorms, so he sleeps on the couch when there's thunderstorms. So we've just been doing that. So we've been getting to them to sleep through the night. Last night, no. So I had to get up with the dogs, and then Ellis got up at like 5 and was having, a nutty. She's 2.5 years old. So, yay, pet ownership. Yay. Whatever, just saying, whatever you guys, think, make your own decisions, right? Make your own decisions. It's there, it's available. It generally works when used properly. Okay, so now that I've made a fool of myself in the midst of all of these things, this is all of glycolysis except for the very last step. Right? This is called the Embden-Meyerhoff pathway. So what you can see at the very top, if I can make the here, okay, is glucose. I take that back. This is not from my human physical. This is actually from my biochemistry book, I think, because you can see the structures on those things. That's all I was thinking about this morning, Christina, when I was in the lab working on some stuff, and Christina was getting ready to teach her nutrition class, and she was listening to the official Dr. Talia teach, and she was talking about, and here we're going to put the glycosyl group over here, and we're going to do this, and I was like, oh God, it's biochemistry. I don't want to do biochemistry. Anyway, glucose. Okay, we're in the muscle cell. Here is glucose. We've gotten the glucose into the cell. The assumption from this pathway is, in this graphic, is that the glucose has come from the bloodstream. This is free glucose. Okay. So it's something that you ate, or it's come from the liver in the form of either breaking down glycogen or gluconeogenesis. The reason you will see here that this is why we're going to cost us an extra ATP is this very first step. I do want you to know this enzyme because it changes with training and it's really freaking important. Okay? The first step, we take the glucose and we break down ATP and we stick a phosphate group onto that glucose. And we make glucose 6-phosphate. Okay? We make glucose 6-phosphate. You don't have to know that we make glucose 6-phosphate. As I told you guys, this is not biochemistry class. But it costs us energy. Adding that phosphate group traps the glucose in the cell, prevents it from diffusing back out. Okay? We will spend like 0 time talking about glucose transporters. We're not going to talk about GLUT1 or GLUT2 or GLUT4. Or anything else that are really important for glucose metabolism and diabetes. We're not going to talk about it, but the glucose gets in by putting the phosphate on, it stays. Okay, it stays. All right. We then take the glucose 6-phosphate and we make fructose. We turn it into fructose. Then we add another ATP and we get fructose 1,6-bi or bisphosphate, depending upon which biochemistry book you read. Okay. If I've got glucose that has come from muscle glycogen, we start here. Basically, we skip the first step. We start here. Okay? So we don't cost ourselves that extra ATP. So we put 1 in here. All right? We're now, from our free glucose, we've now invested 2 ATPs into our glucose molecule. We get to fructose, then we, right, with this isomerase, we're going to split it. So we've got 6 carbons. Glucose has 6 carbons. You guys remember that, right? Here, 6 carbon. Looks like a benzene ring. Looks not benzene, right? 6. Okay. Here, boom, 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 boom. Split 2 3-carbon molecules. Okay. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. All right. And then we've got these 2 things. We've got 2, 6. Now we've got 2 3-carbons. Now we're going to do a very interesting thing that will be of some importance to us. We are going to strip, as this thing moves down this pathway, we're going to pull electrons off of it. Okay? We are going to oxidize this and then use those electrons to reduce our electron transporter, which is called NAD. Okay? NAD. When it gets reduced, it grabs electrons, and then it's gonna put hydrogen. The hydrogen protons are gonna fall. Okay. We're not gonna get into all the biochemistry of all of this. The important thing is that we've taken electrons and from this and we put them on this carrier, and that can be useful to us somewhere down the line. Okay? We then move our way down, and as we do this, when we begin, we're going to begin pulling phosphate molecules off, because remember what happens is you've got this, there's two of them, so this is going to go twice. So at this step, we're going to do it for each one of them. We're going to pull a phosphate off. So we're going to make 2 ATP. We're going to keep going on the way down, and we're going to make 2 more ATP. Okay. So at the end of all of this, we've made 4 ATP, and we have 2 molecules of pyruvate from our glucose molecule. We made 4. If it's free glucose, we invested 2, so we net 2. If it's from glycogen, we invest 1, we net 3. We still have 2 molecules of glucose, and we've reduced 2 electron transporters. I assume that most of you guys have at least seen this before. I was a bio major as an undergrad, and I think we did this in literally every class that I took. So it's very important. All right. Questions? What I do also want you to know, so I want you to know the hexokinase enzyme, and now I want you to know one more enzyme, and I promise that's it for this. I want you to know this enzyme right here, the 3rd step, okay, called phosphofructokinase. It's going to turn us from fructose 6 to fructose 1,6. We abbreviate it as PFK. PFK is the rate limiting step in glycolysis. Richard, for something to be rate limiting, what does that mean?
It occurs less often.
Yes, it occurs less often. That's correct. From a speed standpoint, what does that mean?
I guess it's probably that's not or yeah,
That's the slowest step in the reaction. Okay, so that's the thing that's going to control the rate at which pyruvate is going to be. So very good. Okay. We'll talk more about PFK next week. We'll talk about how it's an allosteric enzyme, and you can make its ability to function go up or down by binding other things to it, which is cool. Okay, but PFK is one of the places where if you get too many hydrogen ions, PFK gets messed up. It gets slowed down, and so this can get backed up. Okay. All right. So we've got pyruvate. This is where things get weird. Okay. This is where things get weird. I'm going to try to draw this out. Talk about what this is. Okay. So this is the way, everyone, that I like to try to note this reaction. Okay. We have glucose. We've made pyruvate. We've made a little bit of ATP. Right, we've got some pyruvate. We've got 2 of those. We've got 2 ATP. We've got 2 NADH. So we've made some stuff. This is good. What happens to the pyruvate is the thing that controls everything else as we go forward. This pyruvate can go into Krebs cycle, go into what we would think of as aerobic metabolism, or this pyruvate can get made into lactic acid. Okay. There's an enzyme here called LDH, enzyme here called PDH. If we go to lactic acid, then we're going to give our electrons back. And we're going to make lactic acid. If we don't go to here, then this is going to go, if it goes this way, it's going to go to electron transport chain, in theory. Okay? We won't handle about how we're going to get the electrons in the mitochondria. There's some things that happen. Okay? But it's this, okay? It's this. This is the part, how this gets to go one way or the other. To me, that's the complicated part of sort of understanding metabolism. Okay? Because this part of the pathway, glucose to pyruvate, is the same. It's the fate of the pyruvate that determines if what we're thinking of happening is that energy is coming from anaerobic metabolism, which some people call anaerobic glycolysis, or if it's coming from aerobic metabolism, which some people call glucose to pyruvate, pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A, to Krebs as aerobic glycolysis. I don't like that. Glycolysis is always anaerobic. We have not used oxygen anywhere, right? It's always anaerobic. It's just what happens in words to pyruvate. Okay? But you'll see it referred to that way. It's very often taught that way to undergrads because it helps to know kind of where things are going. It's just the way it is. Okay? All right.
I don't know if it's a question or not, but your chat, you have a chat problem.
I think that's from Skillet from earlier.
Okay.
She sent it. Okay. See, I haven't put on here. People think of it anaerobically. Pyruvate goes to lactate or lactic acid. They think of it aerobically, it goes to pyruvate, goes to. Okay. So we've worked our way through all of these things. We've done sort of the Embden-Meyerhoff pathway. Then it's going to stay anaerobic, basically, if it goes to lactic acid, driven by an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. And then when that happens, NADH is going to give its electrons back, okay, which is good. We want it to do that so that we need the free electron carriers for later on. Or that pyruvate is going to go through an intermediate step and make something called acetyl coenzyme A. That acetyl coenzyme A then gets into the Krebs cycle. We're inside the mitochondria, and then we're going to go through the Krebs cycle and make a bunch more, take off a bunch more electrons, and make a bunch of energy. Okay. So what we're going to spend a lot of time next week talking about is why does this happen sometimes and why does this happen other times? How can I make one or the other happen more or less often? What are the control steps going to be as all of that works? Because that's the real crux of all of this. Okay? All of you are doing this. You're all making some lactic acid right now as you sit there. Okay? But we can't measure it. But you're still making it. It would be impossible for us to. If we took a finger stick and looked for lactate in the blood, you're all going to have some. It's a very low level, but you're going to have some. And you can walk and you're making even more, and it's still not going to go. If you do a finger stick, it's still not going to go. Did this, talk about pH. Okay. Not the best place for this. I mean, we'll do the graph first, and we'll just talk about it. Okay. And I apologize, I don't have a citation for all of this. Given the way that it looks, this has probably come directly out of the the ACSM's Advanced Exercise Physiology textbook. All of their graphs and things have these blue backgrounds on them. So, as I said, glycolysis, okay, or what people think of as the anaerobic sort of generation of lactic acid is happening all the time. We have a difficult time measuring the actual levels of that lactic acid because I can't see into your muscles. Okay? I've got to see it. You can try to get at it by doing magnetic resonance spectroscopy again, but again, that's not very real world. If we brought the bike in here and we had Shag it on the bike and do things, what's going to happen? Dude, just here we go. Okay. So is okay. Okay, it's dead. Bike. We brought the bike in. We're going to have him get on the bike. We're going to ride. Thank you. When you try to measure, the way that we measure lactic acid levels is we look for lactate in the blood. Right? take a little thingamajigger and puncture their finger, get a drop of blood, put the drop of blood, I should have brought the thing up, could have done it. Put the drop of blood on a little cartridge, and put that into a little machine, and it will tell us how much lactate is in that sample. Okay? Size right in the bite, we're here. Here we go. And we're kind of at a very low level. We're going to increase the power output, but you guys will note that for a while, when you start doing things, you go from sitting to standing to walking to kind of walking fast. If I keep measuring from a finger stick, I don't see an increase in blood lactate. Okay? I don't see an increase. You would think from that, oh, we're not making more lactate, right? Glycolysis, in this instance, when I say glycolysis, I mean going all the way to lactic acid, has not increased. That's wrong. It has. It has gone up. But through some processes that we'll get into a little bit more so, obviously, next week, you make some, but then we do some stuff with the lactate, especially, and some of the hydrogen ions, so we never see it in the blood. Or if it's in the blood, it's in the blood very, very briefly, and then it goes into some other tissue and it's gone. So we don't ever see a measurable increase. Okay? However, there will come a point where you will begin to make so much lactic acid, okay, that at that point in exercise, we will begin to see an uptick in the appearance of lactate in your blood. We will exceed your capacity to essentially soak up the extra lactate. Have a finite capacity for that. That point, that exercise intensity is something called lactate threshold. It is the point at which we see measurable increases in lactate in the blood over resting levels. Okay? Those of you that are our master students, you will take advanced exercise physiology lab with Dr. Bembin, Dr. Bev next semester. You guys will measure this. There's about 18 different ways that people want to try to define this. Some people say it has to be at a level of 4. Blood lactate needs to be 4 millimoles. That's lactate threshold. Probably not. It's probably best defined or most truly defined as the point at which, or sort of immediately before, where we see some measurable consistent increase over resting level. Because everybody's resting levels are a little bit different. Okay? That's lactate threshold. When you reach lactate threshold when you're exercising, you will know it. Okay? This is a border of going from sort of moderate intensity exercise into heavy intensity exercise, as it is very often defined. It's a domain of exercise. You will notice it. It will feel different. Okay? You'll start to feel worse when you get to this particular place. Okay? We're going to come back to this sum. That increase in lactate also is going to correspond to some additional increases in hydrogen ions, which are going to control some changes that we see in breathing response and in ventilation with exercise. Okay? So it's important for us to understand all of those things. Did this, So did this, we talked about this. Yep. So let's start and out. We're not. So we're going to call it off. I'm not having the best lecturing day, so I'm not going to subject y'all to more of me in a muddled state where I can't remember anybody's names. I can't talk. So we're going to stop here.